would now like to ask our hosts and rapporteurs from the World Café, which have done an amazing job in the free time to put all the points together that you have been elaborating. We would like to ask them to give us a short report about their sessions, and I would like to start with food security and sustainable agriculture. And I'd ask Bruno to come up here, please.
Thank you. So our session was hosted by Will McDowell, excellent hosting. We had participants from very different perspectives, which was very interesting. The challenge is food security and sustainable agriculture. The Sustainable Development Goal itself is framed as zero hunger. And I just want to go quickly through the targets. There's a number of targets specifically for 2030, and these are about ending hunger, ending malnutrition, doubling agricultural productivity, ensuring sustainable and resilient food production systems, maintaining genetic diversity of crops, livestock, and relatives. And then there's a number of more generic sort of framings of perhaps a recipe of how to go ahead with that. And this is increased investments in agriculture and agricultural research and infrastructure, correct and prevent trade restrictions, adopt measures to ensure proper functioning of food commodity markets. Proper functioning appear to us as inherently normative, but it's not clear what this is to mean. So in terms of the topics and priorities that we identified, we saw perhaps the first one is a need in these overarching frameworks, which tend to talk about global food chains that tend to be dominated by quite powerful global actors, the need in an African context to recognize the existence of small-scale subsistence farming. And this is about communities, which are largely underrepresented in these frameworks, and also alternative models that have existed for hundreds of years or may be emerging in these communities. So there's a need for recognition of what's happening at this level and harnessing that knowledge. A very related point was about experimentation and projects. And there it's more about how to structure projects. Perhaps they need to be not only foreseen, envisioned as projects bound in time and scale, but needs to be planned one step ahead, thinking about how the positive outcomes of projects can be scaled, perpetuated, circulated after the lifetime of a project ends. We talked about developing consumer demand for more ecological, healthy agricultural products, and that may be an entry point for changes in production systems that may follow from that as well. And there, sorry, this is, I don't have any presentation, but easier this way. And there, policy interventions such as education, procurement, regulation, taxes, sugar taxes, for instance, may be relevant. And we talked about competing priorities of actors, and this being a really important issue in agriculture food systems specifically. So the dominance of large, powerful actors really dominating bottlenecks in supply chains. And they tend to impose a specific kind of logic of scaling, of intensification, and associated with that are specific consumer marketing strategies, and this is something to think about. There's a clear asymmetry of power, and maybe transformation to sustainable systems should take this into account. There's a lot of gatekeeping going on, and how can we work in spite of these power asymmetries with incumbents also perhaps, around incumbents, below them. There's different kinds of ways of thinking about that. So about shifting global supply chains, and perhaps the allocation of profits within there. It's about supporting alternatives and perhaps the idea of lifting trade restrictions on fair trade, for instance, could be one thing to think about. Lastly, about these topics and priorities, we saw a number of linkages with other sustainable development goals, notably goal number 2, education. So I alluded to that, especially the issue of malnutrition, dietary change. How can we encourage these kind of changes in practice and lifestyle? Sustainable Development Goal 8, about growth in jobs. especially when we start thinking about talking about alternative models, alternatives to intensive production. Extensive forms of production may have something really interesting to say to the issue of jobs and growth nationally or internationally. Number 10, justice and inequality. If we start recognizing more locally empowering alternatives, obviously there is a point about just transitions there that could be an interesting entry point. And goal number 12 about responsible consumption, production, and circularity. And we really think about how can we think about circularizing agri-food systems, especially when we start thinking about waste, which is a recurring problem in food consumption. About the knowledge outcomes now, we talked a lot about co-benefits. There was a particular case suggested about how can we start thinking in local context about invasive species and dealing with them to perhaps produce bioenergy from them, contribute to land restoration programs, etc. So there's a lot of innovative kind of ways of linking multiple benefits together in the agri-food, in and beyond the agri-food system. About knowledge, we saw that, there is such extensive knowledge out there. It's really about how to harvest and share this existing knowledge, as well as filling the gaps that might be identified. The sustainability of local and traditional production is something, there's a huge amount of tacit knowledge about this, about African foodstuff, etc., but this is perhaps not shared enough and not brought to the conversation enough. A very interesting point about actually one step towards being more action-oriented about the knowledge we bring to the table is to visualize and map the existing knowledge that we have on systems. Once you start mapping, really visually representing a food chain and the bottlenecks, the power concentrations that emerge at different parts of the food chain. This is images can have really powerful consequences for the general public, but also for policymakers that can perhaps identify problems better. So the issue of concentration of power, the circulation of goods and the way these food chains are configured, the issue of waste along these chains, there's scope for representation there. New and emerging models of production, we talked about that, and we thought this needs to become a bit more mainstream in the discussion. So the issue of regenerative agriculture, for instance, organic modes of production, precision farming, etc. It needs to come into the mainstream. Circulation of knowledge between localities. So we've discussed some, for instance, there's a forum of the larger cities in South Africa. The mayors communicate quite well between themselves, and how can you emulate this at different scales across countries, etc. And there's a big discussion about this in Europe as well, and ICLE is here representing these kinds of networks that facilitate the circulation of knowledge, not only about best practices, but also about failures, and how can we be creative and locally. Related to that, and now I'm going into new models for collaboration and knowledge, the last question, there was a point about, so how do we start thinking about these new forms of circulating knowledge, accumulating knowledge, sharing it, putting people together in different localities, and terms such as translocal started emerging, cosmolocal started emerging. So it's not necessarily just about national, regional, trickle-downs or hierarchical flows of knowledge, but there might be spaces in between, and this is particularly relevant for a system like agri-food, where a lot bits of the system have an inherently local character, but perhaps not always connected. And I think perhaps two last points that I think were particularly important. One relates to problems with the scientific knowledge production and its availability, its open availability. From the perspective of, for instance, a research development agency or funder, one could see that there's a lot of duplication of research efforts, simply because one does not know and monitor the knowledge that is developed on the ground or even in research projects. The issue of open access sounds crucial. I mean, the European Union has a policy on that and is trying to push it, but is going very slow, and this is certainly reinforcing power asymmetries, empowerment asymmetries, and this is really a priority to be dealing with. And lastly, the issue of balancing between, exploring new modes, exploring new ways, configurations that these agri-food systems can take, versus, just doing it, exploiting this knowledge, doing it, reproducing the good practice that works. Last point, I just want to allude to, and perhaps point to a colleague at Vinnova, who was talking about new forms of framing, shaping, producing research agendas so that they might be more attuned, more aligned with societal challenges. Not necessarily specifically in agriculture, very general knowledge that the Swedish Vinnova agency is trying to push. And they call this model challenge-driven innovation. I won't go into the technicalities because I'm sure I won't give it justice, but really the way I understand it is not to start with predefined goals and specificities about how to do this research, but really start small, discuss, co-produce, and then scale. Thank you very much. I'll keep it to this because I'm way out of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bruno, for this comprehensive look at food security and sustainable agriculture. I think it was quite a challenge, and you were a little bit out of your comfort zone, so I'm like other people as well, but as we know, it's at the crossroads of different things that innovation is happening. So maybe this is coming up with something excellent. With this, I would like to ask Carlos for climate action to come up. We have already seen quite a part of his slides, but don't mind, we just do it again.
Yeah, it's very nice to talk after you have watched the movie twice actually. Before I talk, anyway. It was a very interesting session, a very fruitful discussion also, and we had a very smart group of people participating, so we managed not only to cluster different issues related to climate action, but also try to find linkages between those and tools or approaches that could be falling in between these different aspects. So first of all, one key issue, regardless of most of the comments and ideas, were related to adaptation, also the mitigation aspects, and committing to the CO2 emission targets was mentioned as one crucial and fundamental issue to keep in mind and to respect at the international level. Besides that, we identified another cluster of ideas and issues that were related to business focus and incentives to actually make climate transitions happen at the social level, but also at the business level through incentives, through new business models, through new ideas of how to actually capture that business dimension of climate action and make it happen on businesses and enterprises. In relation to that, it was mentioned that these new risk insurance aspects that are becoming more and more important could actually make the linkage between the business dimension or the business layer and also the local and resilience and vulnerability and risk management aspects that keep being on the agendas, on the table in every conversation are very, very important, and a number of ideas and comments were related actually to that overall approach of handling climate action at local level as a risk management practice actually. So besides that, we also reflected and talked a lot about capacity building, awareness, communication, exchange, etc. That not only at a local level, at the social level, but also at an organizational and enterprise level. And that could be linking these two dimensions of capacity building, awareness, and the business arena. Besides that, governance aspects were also on the table, in particular in relation to cooperation, coordination specifically, across borders, and both vertically and horizontally. So international cooperation and also regional cooperation with our peers and across cities. And then all of this was explicitly and implicitly related to systems thinking and to approaching this climate action challenge from a systemic perspective. And there was mentioned the nexus, but also other more limited interactions between different spheres that are very relevant for systems thinking. Perhaps the two more relevant that were mentioned were agriculture on the one hand, which, by the way, we forgot to include here specifically, and energy planning and access to energy also at the local level. So energy planning would be more operating at a larger level, and access to energy, to safe energy at a local level would be more the local and the community dimension of the energy aspects. And connecting all these and somehow monitoring all these, there should be some kind of additional tools or focus on the way of, tracking progress towards those objectives related to mitigation, those related to adaptation, participation, awareness, whatever. So this is on the key topics and priorities. Sorry. Now, when it comes to the key knowledge outcomes that could be expected from current research, these three issues were mentioned. First, low carbon development patterns, in particular in relation to urbanization in Africa and consumption and carbon linkages in Africa, which are highly under-researched and that really need a real and operational answer now, because urbanization, as yesterday somebody mentioned, is happening now, and it's happening in Africa, essentially in the world. So there should be an answer to that challenge from the research arena. Second, how to mainstream, to use, to integrate local knowledge, communal knowledge on formal scientific knowledge. How to combine those two types of knowledge into a consistent, integrated new type of knowledge that can provide answers not only to the science community, but also to local communities, and to actually help them find practical, feasible, and cost-efficient solutions for them, for their own challenges that are related to climate action. And finally, a new prosperity as a more disruptive proposal, and new mindset or total shift. There was proposed a new prosperity paradigm, because it was claimed by somebody in our table that in any case it could not be feasible to achieve these targets under this economic system. So if we want to really achieve something, we should really think about a very disruptive change based on a new economic system and a new paradigm that could be allowing us to actually deliver on these challenges. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. That's why we have included here as last and most disruptive kind of insight that could be delivered by the research arena. But I don't think that is only up to the researchers to propose. Anyway, in terms of new models for cooperation, again, goal setting that is crucial, and cooperation around goal setting and identifying specific needs from businesses, communities, and so forth, and cooperate around common goals and shared ways of identifying these goals and set targets. That was something that was mentioned. Also, the need for new approaches, incentive for cooperation over businesses and geographical borders that are somehow overcoming the barriers we have right now to cooperate, to exchange, due to formal or informal barriers we have at different levels. Was also mentioned that's something to progress in that direction. In terms of methods, integrated knowledge exchange and challenge-driven innovation was also mentioned here. Yeah, just one more and I'm done. And value chain collaboration or collaboration over value chains, not only across borders, communities, etc., but also from a business perspective, cooperation over value chains of products and services. And some very specific ideas here. For example, a possible potential KIC, knowledge innovation capacity, which is a sort of European institution or a form of cooperation that has been institutionalized by the European Union, was proposed for climate action as a possible container for these new ideas. Sustainable development goals-driven innovation procurement, Uber for energy in Africa was mentioned as something that could be interesting to have to help local communities access energy provision. Again, a new definition of knowledge as a combination of formal and informal knowledge, not only scientific knowledge. Cooperation with people, driven by people, and based on people's needs. That's crucial. And here we identify the various levels of cooperation, city to city, community to community, different types of governance cooperation, vertical, horizontal, etc. And also within Africa, that was mentioned as a key issue for South Africans, because they felt that somehow they were not really connecting with other African countries and exchanging knowledge around this topic with other African countries. IT-enabled exchange, everything related to social media, crowdsourcing, etc. And the last one, new experimentation platforms, which is something that was mentioned before as well. So thank you. And also thank you to the people that participated, because it was very fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is affordable and clean energy. So I would like to ask Massimiliano to give us the report on your table.
So let's move to this picture. So that's my attempt to. So let's start from here. We emphasized in the panel and emphasized the need for basic and high education investments. This is well known that education investments are linked to technological issues. We need the capacity, to build up the capacity to absorb knowledge. Also, this is linked to behavioral change that we need to have in order to introduce new ways of consuming energy. And there is also the strong link between education and inequality. The two dynamics may be correlated over time with different patterns. Okay. And then this is also linked to, there was a very, very important emphasis on local knowledge, local stakeholder analysis before introducing policies and innovation, and local ownership as well. I emphasize this fact because someone raised at some stage this point, the limits of technological transfers. I pointed out this issue, okay? And also we debated about the need to set up industrial capacity in Africa. This is linked to the fact, I don't know if you know the evolution over time, this is a structural change fact. The manufacturing, the value-added manufacturing in Africa has decreased from 9% 25 years ago to 4%. And the high-tech share of industries is stagnating over 25 years. So it is true that those are resource-based economies, but then you also know, don't want to be academic, you know the resource course hypothesis. Resources may drive poverty traps, or if you don't use sustainable way, I mean the rents out of resources. So this industrial capacity behind renewable energy production is something that should be linked to local knowledge to create asset-specific type of production and consumption. Okay, which is also true for okay, because it's a bit there. Okay, thank you. Oh, very effective. Thank you very much. Wow. And then at the core, affordability and social acceptability, that I also link to policies. So again, okay. Better and better, maybe. I could also say there now. So policies, linking back to what Carlos was saying, that we also emphasize the fact that energy, okay, but again, we have to create links between energy settings and climate policy, because climate policies are the main driver at the international level, so that's is not to be forgotten. Okay. In terms of development, PPP type of scenarios were highly emphasized as key drivers of market development. So public PPP issues, policies linked together, and both have to be coherent with the development of markets in early stages. There's also linked, I created a link to what Franz Berkhout was presenting in the Kuznets type of framework this morning. So we are in a framework where you may have high inequality, so you can both have high willingness to pay and low willingness to pay. So you have to play with different markets and very different situations when renewable markets develop. Finally, geography. Africa and also Europe, also other areas are composed of regions with their heterogeneities. So the issue of linking regions' knowledge, so to aggregate different knowledge and different asset specificities that develop around with in mind the different nexus features that you may have across countries and regions. So again, final thought is to be very specific in terms of who the players are, the sectors, the geography of one size fits all paradigm is evidently not applicable in those situations, if any. Okay. The other slide with about models is simpler. I highlight 3 points. One is supporting new demands. I mean, market demand is relevant. So, and many people highlighted the need to create even from top down through international investments and funds the first stimulus to demand, because we have to have demand in order to innovate, in order to create. Green industrial strategy, but this is linking back to the necessity to create industrial capacity, increasing the share of manufacturing value added in African regions. And then final point, a bit provocative, but I think it's really useful. There is, this was the point, a fragmentation in the EU about the projects and strategies developed by different countries, and maybe linked too extensively to forming colonies. So the point is to find better integration of strategies from the EU side, instead of having many strategies around. And here we also debated the difference between the EU and the US approach, I mean the recent US and new approach to African development. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano. So we go straight into clean water and sanitation. And Alan, who is going to let us know what has been debated there. You had a lot of very good drawings there. I could see it already.
All right. Yeah, so this was all about the SDG 7, clean water and sanitation. I'm assuming everybody in the audience knows more or less what the development goal is. And it came out in the discussion of the group around universal access to water. Water is an especially important part down here in this part of the world. I mean, just something interesting, the currency of Botswana is pula, and that means rain. All right, so water is a real crucial issue, and you know all about the crisis that we're facing in the southwest of the country. Sanitation and access to sanitation is an aspect that is in the constitutional right in South Africa. There was a lot of talk about how to improve water quality from a pollution perspective. Here where you are, we're sitting, well, not specifically here, but in Johannesburg, we're sitting with a major acid mine drainage, which is a legacy of a whole mining industry that we need to deal with. We had a whole discussion around water use efficiency, and it's actually crazy in this country. And I think we can learn from many of our colleagues in Europe around how to recycle and reuse water. So that came up quite a lot. Integrated water resource management is an aspect that is addressed in the South African regulations, but we felt a lot more could be done. And also in terms of protecting our ecosystems, aquifers, and those kind of aspects came to the front. And yeah, and this right at the bottom here, that's in the SDG, also came out without really looking at this poster beforehand, but this whole participation with communities. And I think this links up a little bit to the discussion that we had yesterday morning. So yeah, the three questions that we posed were first the key topics and priorities. It's sort of interesting with the two groups. So when the first group ended and said they're going to move on, it was like, well, we're just going to tell the same stuff in the next table, right? I mean, because it's not that big difference between water and energy, but there were some differences. I think the first group tended to lean more towards, I would say, softer issues, and the second group more towards harder issues. And maybe that's a way to distinguish around it. So, but then Imke and I did try and group them sort of together in sort of common themes that came out between the two groups. So resource management, and that refers more to ecosystem services natural ecosystem services versus infrastructure management processes, which is something that we're really struggling with in the South African context. There's a lot of emphasis in our industry that we need a lot more capacity and physical asset management. And that's something we can talk about in terms of knowledge transfer. And then we're just alternative technologies, how we're going to use grey water more effectively and more, like I said, hardware innovation versus just simply looking in communities in terms of energy access and provision and looking at innovations at a small community type of scale. Governance came up as a sort of general concept, but then life cycle accounting, which is something that we're not really considering in a South African context. In life cycle accounting, we typically talk about water footprinting. We don't even know what the embodied water is of a lot of our products. And we need to think about international regulations. So as an example, a lot of private sector, there's a lot of private sector response in South Africa to the European targets of getting more biofuels and usage. But, you know, from a life cycle perspective, depending on which product you're looking at, you know, you can look at about a ton of water for a litre of biofuels that you export. So what are we exporting? And so that's a key issue that we need to consider. And then, as I mentioned, community of stakeholder informed practices. So if I look at governance, there's a whole lifecycle approach, and then the community. So it's again this old thing about top-down, bottom-up. We can't simply, and we'll get to that this afternoon in a policy discussion. We tend to be well equipped from a top-down perspective, but how we actually do things on the ground and how we get information from the ground, and I think that we'll get to that in a moment in terms of some of the models. And then, there's a big issue around education and capacity building, and two issues came out there that I thought was interesting, is just curriculum development for schools, and maybe there's some collaborative learning that we can do with our colleagues in Europe, and how practically some of the stuff is incorporated into curricula. It's the kids that we need, or children that we need to get on board. I'm sure those of you that have children know that you get wrapped on the fingers if you don't think about these things these days. And then also just communication. How do we communicate to society in general? And then lastly, Carlos may mention that, this whole systems approach also came out as quite strongly. In terms of outcomes that we expect from research from the group, again, quite different approaches. I mentioned the water footprinting and having more knowledge sharing platforms. And we also talked about eco-labeling. That's something that doesn't exist in South Africa. We're really struggling in the last decade to get a decent water star rating off the ground, similar to what might be available in European countries. So the LCA labeling came out as an aspect. And then obviously this is Africa. So agriculture, and right at this point in time in the Western Cape, that's one of our biggest agricultural produce parts of the country. We are going to lose the entire crop this year because of climate change and how rain patterns have changed. So we need more or better tools to understand how climate change is going to influence future agricultural production. And then it was also mentioned, so that's again, it's a sort of high level down to the ground. So innovative irrigation methods, drip methods is stuff that we've been doing in South Africa already, but maybe we can improve on that. Yes, as I said, a lot of talk about improvements in efficiencies all over the show, recycling, there were a whole lot of points made around that. And then I think the last one I left, which is really important for me, is this synergies or interaction between, let's call it conventional science and then indigenous knowledge. Because, and how do we capture that indigenous knowledge, and what does it mean, and what do we use it, and how do we transfer that? And that comes into new models. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So shared value symbiosis, what this discussion was all about was what we expect from research is just how industry and local government level can actually work together better. We've had one or two examples where, for example, Nestlé has been doing quite good work to interact with the local municipality where they have the operations to improve their water infrastructure. Nestlé does require it for the operation, they need good clean water, and the local infrastructure was just not adequate. So there are good opportunities there for knowledge sharing and technology transfer. Global formal collabs using global society, and Guillaume came up, or maybe I'm going to ask him to share, because as you said, as we said in Cape Town, we have a real water crisis. We're talking about the D-Day, when the water is going to run out effectively. So again, just what are you guys going to be doing to try and solve this crisis of ours?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. We're planning to hold a hackathon called Hack the Cape Town Water Crisis. And we're working with the Cape Town Science Centre and the University of Loughborough in the UK. They're going to bring on their PhD students in January. And then some other networks, open source circular economy network. And the idea is to try to, because we might run out of water, reach zero water day by January 2018, which is not too far away. and I've already experienced. If you lived in Cape Town, you know what's like right now, no, dealing with the water crisis. But we think that we have to run the first leg of the hackathon in December because of how close it is. So we just want to gather ideas first and do a situational analysis, and then pass off what information we have to the University of Loughborough, and take it from there. So any partners who want to come on board, you're all welcome to, because the more the merrier.
But just explain a little bit more what a hackathon means in this context.
Hackathon is just getting a whole bunch of people together and just brainstorming, coming up with ideas. You know, in the software world, when you have a hackathon, you have a lot of coders coming together and doing that. But here, we're just going to brainstorm and see what kind of ideas we can come up with first. But it's going to be probably at the Cape Town Science Center, but local. But we could try to arrange to see if other people can contribute from around the world as well. But it's going to be an ongoing thing because you can't solve it by just having one weekend. So there's going to be multiple stages over the years, and it might lead to a Hack the Global Water Crisis hackathon, which includes multiple cities that are suffering water stress as well.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting way, innovative way of getting a lot of people to contribute virtually. It's open source, so that information is available.
Yeah, we're testing. Just one last point. We're testing this concept of cosmo-localization, where using the internet to create a global design commons, so everybody can share the knowledge, and then we can all download it wherever we are to apply it locally.
Yeah.
Please let us have this information. We can spread the information about your hackathon on inno4sd so that more people can join in.
Yeah, it's a real world application of all the stuff we're talking about because we're in crisis right now.
Great. Thank you. Ian, and thanks for the suggestion, Astrid. And then also, because that's more on a formal, again, high level, but then we're looking at community informal collabs and how to engage with communities, how to extract that information and indigenous knowledge. And I thought what was interesting out of that discussion was you don't get that knowledge in a conventional way. You get it through forms like art forms. Get people to use art to express or what their challenges are and what they see as the solutions. African culture is all about storytelling, so get people to tell stories, compile stories, songs. A lot of information is carried over by song, and that might be a very good way. And what, as Gian said, is people construct a song, and then it's also a way for the Western to engage with it, to understand what the information is. Lastly, and then it's just educational material and knowledge through play is what we called it. We need a lot more gamification, and the CSIR has developed a board game. We talked about apps and so on, because that's the way the kids learn these days. Not through, I know we can have a whole critique over wine just now or later, but they want to read a book. They want to learn through play. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I would also like to say thank you for the nice format of presenting the outcome. I think we can use this as a good practice example. That looked very nice, and so maybe for the next year we will propose that. And one last remark from me with regard to games. I think there's some quite interesting and nice games also for grown-up people on innovation and how to spread it, and maybe we can use something like that as well for that sector. With that, I would like to ask Rene to come up and speak about responsible consumption and production and the discussions you had at your table.
So no PowerPoint from me. Sorry for that. Just an old-fashioned Word file with some things noted down by Peter. And I've been asked to present it. Many of the things have already been said, sort of the importance of local knowledge in particular. But what I will do is I will go through the inputs from people in a structured way. So what we did is we structured the insights according to a number of topics, one of which is business models for sustainable consumption and production. A business model, an earning model, which allows you to do what you're doing is a necessary condition. And here you can think about a business model for a company, a single company, but also about business model in broader sense, a business model for, let's say, a partnership for a whole value chain in which, well, burdens are shared and in which there are also sufficient earnings for everyone. Well, we talked about local, short value chains, and we talked about global value chains. We didn't arrive at a clear conclusion on that topic. But certainly local value chains have a number of advantages in the sense that the actors know each other. It's more difficult to do things which are irresponsible. Well, you can draw on local knowledge and sort of take care of local concerns. And so there's certainly a case to be made for shorter supply chains. Well, one of the things that was said, well, perhaps we don't need entirely new business models. You know, there's a whole literature about business models and business model for sustainability. You know, the key issue is to work out the details of those business models for the issue that you're dealing with. Buyback programs may be useful for well, for creating a business model, well, many of the products, well, there's too much products which are being disposed, so what we need is other projects and higher quality products, you know, well, will lead less to this quick disposal. Now, we talked about the issue of supply chain management, so the greening of supply chains. Well, this greening is not something that companies can always do on their own, so there's a clear role for government there. Producer responsibility is one way is one approach that is useful. It's been tried and tested in Europe with some positive results, but you should not expect also too much from it. Well, for making it easy to engage in sustainable production and consumption, an enabling framework, you know, it makes things easier. It can level the playing field, and well, there are many things that can enable this, and there's a long list of issues that you can read. I won't read it out. Education. You know, attention to the issue of driving a secondary resource economy, which, you know, could be the basis for a programmatic approach. Sustainable public procurement is important and is already tried in Africa. Well, there's issues of experimentation and learning. Others have already mentioned as something important. Yeah, I mean, we also had a couple of don'ts. One of the don'ts was, well, you can't really rely on sustained subsidies, so that's an approach which probably only works in the short term. Another thing that's been said by Henry Roman was, don't go for waste for energy, and this is exactly what Europe has done, and it's making it very difficult then to engage in repair and reuse activities, which actually, you know, have much more to offer also for dealing with issues of creating a more local and responsible economy and dealing with issues of exclusion. Now, the context itself is often not enabling. I think it's important sort of to actually acknowledge that. I mean, certainly in Africa, we've got a context in which poverty, exclusion and inequality are important. So these are also priority issues, and they may not go well with issues of eco-innovation. We've heard in the presentation of Linda that waste management is not a priority. I think that holds true for greening more generally. And I think it's also correct to say that for many of the consumers, you know, those issues are also not priority issues. So, as in Europe, I think people's aspiration as consumers well, are mostly, aspirations as consumer, let's put it that way, and that creates all kinds of barriers. And it was even mentioned that coal energy or coal electricity is even favored over renewable electricity by some people because, well, for cultural reasons. Another structural problem, and I think we all know that, is that an economy based on profit maximization, where investments always seek the highest profits, is really to the detriment of sustainable consumption and production, and is also to the detriment of a local economy. So if part of the profits could only be invested more locally, I think that would already make a big difference. In the case of waste, let's say the cheap landfilling is a big problem in the African context, certainly in this country, but also many other countries, of which I'm not an expert. But we heard that this actually will change because the problems are growing so big in terms of landfill capacity that new landfills have to be created. They're likely to be created farther away. This will drive up costs, and I think this is when, going to be helpful for creating a secondary resource economy. Well, I've arrived at the last topic that we discussed, which is the topic of a local economy. I think that's an important topic, to give more attention to. So this then consists about sort of localized solutions. And an example, we heard of several examples, one of which is to use the water from toilets for watering land, and also to have biogas plants for generating electricity. Those are perfectly viable, sort of in the local context. I also learned about a system I didn't know, which is the Stokvel Oezoe system in South Africa, in which people bring together money, it's community-based sort of money system. Well, it's sort of crowdfunding, but it's the wrong word, crowdfunding. What I learned is that people bring together money, so they save a little money, and each of them can use some of that money, and it's often used for weddings and burials. Yeah, I was looking for the word, but it can also be used for other purposes, like solar equipment, for instance. Now. Maybe as a last thing to say, that we should not only be thinking about technology, but also thinking about alternative ways of doing things, sort of organizationally or as a community. So there's also an important role for place-based organizational innovations or social innovations. This can consist of things that are being shared, cooperation more generally, things which are sort of collectively owned, maybe as a last thing to say about this is not, not only something instrumental, but also something which is valuable in its own sense, because it actually is creating an economy which is based on cooperation and mutual aid, and certainly in Europe those things have really deteriorated, and as I said, these are valuable in their own right. So this is what I sort of can say in those 5 minutes I have. I think we had good discussions, and I hope it was clear what I just said. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rene, also for your report. I think very, very well structured, very, very good things that you have come up with. Thank you very much. I have a little question to you. Who has been participating in a World Café before? All right. So can we do the other way around? Who has never participated in a World Café? Okay, not so many people. So how did you find the exercise in general? Did you like it? Was positive? Yeah? Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much. I would like to say thank you to Will, Bruno, Carlos, Pierre, Simone, Massimiliano, Alan, Imke, Rene, and Peter. And I would like you to give him a big applause for all the work they've been doing.